from our last visit, we sort
Yes.
of discussed on covering a few topics at whatever length again that you can speak to them or respond to any array of questions that will come up along the way for me. But I believe our intent for this episode was to have you sort of paint the picture when you started in the industry. The
Hmm.
primary point to start with, I think, was the dynamics of boat crews
Right.
and how that has metamorphosed into its current state over those 50 years.
Yeah. So in 1975, I think there was like 20 towboat companies in Greenville, Mississippi. There were, uh, well, the way I got my first job was I went to the library and got the yellow pages for every town, big town along the river. And I looked up towboat companies and called them all up and got applications and sent them in. And so, Cincinnati, Louisville, Paducah, Nashville, St. Louis, St. Paul, a lot of union companies. There were a lot of companies. And one of the things we started talking about last time was in the 80s, the change that came to the industry in the 80s. So the one that I'm most familiar with, because I got to sit in the pilot house with my mentor, Ike Sullivan, and listen, because he had started out in the late 50s for Apple Towing and worked on union boats and worked on non-union boats and eventually went to work for Bernhardt Brothers out of Cassville, Wisconsin. And Bernhardt Brothers then became, when Ray Eckstein married into the Bernhardt family, Bernhardt Brothers became Wisconsin Barge Line. And Wisconsin Barge Line operated for a long time. And one of some of the first, well, yeah, probably the first of the 6,000 horsepower hydrodyne hull St. Louis ship boats were like the Penny of Cassville and uh, the Vince Tranqueta, the not the Marie Hendricks, but a couple of those others. And I remember standing on the riverbank in front of my house in about 1970 and watching one of those brand new 6,000s go past. And it was raining and cold, and I could see the guy in the pilot house. And I thought, boy, that'd be a pretty good job. So I kept working towards it. There were a lot of petroleum companies. I went to work for Inland Oil and Transport. And as I said last time, we pushed barges on contract during the grain season for Sioux City and New Orleans. And at that time, uh, freight was regulated, kind of like the airlines were regulated. It was a way of subsidizing transportation. So if we go back to the Great Depression and the building of the Upper Mississippi River system, the federal government, the Roosevelt administration, and economists there recognized that they had to have a dependable way to get farm products out of the Midwest and coal and farm products out of the Ohio River Valley to the Gulf for export. And that, at the way things were set up prior to 1935, it was really catch as catch can. For example, on the Ohio, they would have to wait until the high water season. So there were coal boats that came out of the Monongahela River and waited in fleets until the rainy season came and they could take the barges on downstream. So you had to have a more dependable transportation system than that. So the uh, WPA and the federal government built the locks and dams and all of the lights and all of the structures on the upper Miss. That opened up uh, the opportunity for guys like Bernhardt Brothers to make the capital investment, to come up with the money out of their pocket and go to the bank and get a loan because they knew they had a dependable way of operating a business. So then as we move along, Bernhardt Brothers became Wisconsin. Towboats became uh, more sophisticated, higher horsepower, more powerful, could run more barges. So then 15 barge tows went from standards, which were 175 by 25, and stumbos, which were 195 by 20, to jumbo hopper barges that we see now are 195 or 200 by 35. So we started running much bigger tows. And then as the channel conditions improved, uh, then started running deeper drafts. Went from an 8 foot uh, draft in a 9 foot guaranteed channel to running 9 foot 6 out of the upper miss, and sometimes at times, and maybe from Clinton on down, being able to run 10 foot draft. So then in the period of inflation in the late 70s and into the 80s, it was cheap to borrow money and pay it back with inflated dollars. You know, as inflation hits, you give me $1, and if you have a certain rate of inflation, when it comes time for me to pay you back, I'm only paying you back 80 cents. So it's to my advantage to go ahead and borrow money to expand my business. And Wisconsin Barge Line started on a building program, and they built the Acadian Jane and all of those 8400s and 10.5s. The first of that batch, first of the 10.5s, was the J.S. McDermott for Federal Barge Line. Federal Barge Line is just what it sounded like. It was a federally chartered, regulated barge line. Mississippi Valley Line, the same way. Sioux City and New Orleans, there were different. And on the Ohio, there were some as well. So the industry built these big boats thinking that they could run 30 barges at that time because the river conditions weren't that good, but there really wasn't enough water. The channel conditions were not that good to operate those really big high horsepower boats, and they never really reached their potential. But for example, the Miss KD actually was owned by Ray Eckstein and chartered to Flowers. So there were those class of boats were built, and then Wisconsin extended itself even further and bought some fleets in the New Orleans area and some fleets in the St. Louis area and expanded out again, and they overreached. And when they overreached, they had to go public with the company. And when they did, Archer Daniels Midland, a subsidiary, were the ones that bought a controlling interest. And they voted Ray Eckstein and his group out of the company and took it under the Artco flag. I think Joe Rose at that time had a controlling interest in Artco because that's how the Acadian Jane became the Crimson Duke, name it after roses. Agritrans was another company that operated primarily on the Illinois River, moving grain for a farmer's co-op in the Illinois River Valley. And that was originally Rose Barge Lines. That's where the American Beauty and the Crimson Gem got their name, because they were Rose Barge Line boats in their first incarnation. So those boats all wound up under the ADM Artco umbrella. And then Ray Eckstein went and got financing to start the first incarnation of Marquette Transportation. And Ike Sullivan went with him to Marquette Transportation as the port captain. Ike told me a story about walking out of God, I think Citizens Bank in Cincinnati. You can see it above the stadium as you go past the riverfront. Walking out of there with a $3 million check to take the Jeff boat for the Captain Ike Sullivan. So money was easy, and the industry started on a building program. And a combination of things hit about that time. The industry built anticipating growing demand because of grain being exported and export coal markets, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and Jimmy Carter put an embargo on grain, which collapsed the U.S. grain export market. So there goes the grain that was being shipped in barges. And then the South Africans came online with a very viable coal mining industry that undercut U.S. Union miners terribly, and that destroyed the U.S. export coal market. So Ike Sullivan, Marquette at that time had put most all of their eggs in the coal market. And, Ike told me stories of barges sitting in fleets in New Orleans loaded with coal and getting wet and sitting in that heat until finally they started to spontaneously combust. And that was going on all up and down. And one day, Ray just said, well, they went to, Ray had a contract, and I think, and I'm maybe wrong on this, but I think it was with Green River Coal. And they went into the executive inn in Owensboro to have a meeting. The guy flies in on his corporate airplane, comes in, sits down with Ray, says, I'm going to pay you 10 cents on the dollar to buy out these contracts. You got 20 minutes to either take it or leave it. I'm getting on my airplane and leaving. And so that was the end of Marquette Transportation. They owed a lot of money for barges. They owed a lot of money in boats, and they went under. So Ike Sullivan, as a result, because banks don't know anything about running towboats, they offered towboats to guys like Ike Sullivan if they could make the interest payment on the loan. And so I got the Joe Pat, the John Paul, the Carl H, the Per Marquette. He got those former Marquette boats, and he was operating them. American Finance Corporation got the rest of Marquette's boats, and that's where Spartan Transportation came from, because Spartan was started under the umbrella of American Finance to operate these boats rather than just have them sitting there neglected and rusting out. And so the Parthenon, the Ulysses, the Olympus, Ingram has all of those boats now, the Sam Richmond, the Bill Barry, not the John Rivers, but those boats were all Spartan boats. They were all American Finance Corporation boats. And when things started to pick up, markets started to pick up. For example, with Ingram, Craig Phillip was the executive assistant or executive vice president or something to Bronson Ingram. Craig Phillip was an MIT grad, PhD from MIT, with a degree in civil transportation engineering. Primarily, he was a railroad guy and understood how to make rail cars make their most moves, the most cargo moves in a fiscal year. And Ingram was looking at that rather than looking at towboats. Ingram at that point was a liquids company, and they were running petroleum products, and they got a contract with Commonwealth Edison, built those big Commonwealth Edison tows, and the Hortense Ingram and those boats to push that stuff along with the Sam Fleming and Andrew Benedict, and those boats would run the upper part of the Illinois. And Craig Phillip recognized a trend that you could buy assets cheap and get in before the next boom that started. And so that's how Ingram Barge Company became a big player. Now, ACBL had consolidated American barge lines and commercial barge lines years before to become American Commercial Barge Line. And they were operating uh, with guys still around like the Blasky brothers and people who had originally been towboaters. Grew up in towboat families, and their fathers or grandfathers had bought towboats and built a company. So those companies were operating along like that. And because Ingram is privately held, they've retained control of the company. But companies like ACBL wound up being publicly held. And that's where, in the last episode, we started talking about investment bankers and predatory capitalism wringing the assets out of a company. So, for example, in the late 80s, well, I worked twice for Conti Carriers. In the early 80s, before the big crash, and in the late 80s, as things were picking back up, Conti Carriers pushed grain for Continental Grain Company. And they had built a bunch of Jeff boats, really nice boats. And it came to a point where uh, Continental Grain and the board of directors decided they didn't want to operate a towboat company anymore. And they started wringing the assets out of the company. So the first thing they did was reduce the crew sizes and cut crew costs. And so they got rid of the assistant engineers. They went on the upper from a 6-man deck crew to a 5-man, put 1 man on call watch. And then we get this letter that says they want us to run cheap. They called it cheaper, deeper, faster. And it was from the guy that was the head of Conti Carriers at the time, who said, you know, guys, if we'll just load to 9'6" and you go faster and we'll run cheaper, we're going to make a ton of money. And what they did was they just sucked the assets out of the company. They got as much revenue as they could from the company, and then they sold all those boats and barges to ACBL, who was their the bank that the investment firm that was backing ACBL was on a buying binge at that time. So this always reminds me at when I worked at Siemens Church, uh, Ingram sent me to a lot of leadership training, and one of the guys told a story about how the boss has a picnic for his employees out at his house. And it's this nice house up on the hill with a pond and green pastures and a horse barn. And he takes his general manager out and he said, you know, all of this is because you've been working so hard for me and done such a good job. And the guy said, well, thank you. And he said, and you know, if you do that for another 10 years, I can own all the rest of this surrounding land. So it's it was a story about motivating employees and getting them to buy in rather than, I'm going to take this stuff. I want you guys to work harder. I'm not going to pay you anymore. I'm going to reduce the crew size, but I want you to work harder so I can make more money, basically, is what they were telling us. At that point, I moved to Ingram. About 4 months later, ACBL bought Conti Carriers. And then eventually, ACBL was on a buying spree and they bought Mississippi Valley Line. Then Midland Enterprises, which the parent company was a power company in the Northeast, bought the other Valley Line Federal Barge Lines and brought them under their. So now you're reducing the amount of companies that we can all go to work for, a choice of who to work for, reducing that constantly. So ADM has picked up Artco picked up Wisconsin Barge Lines and Agritrans. There's 2 companies, good, viable, quality companies gone. Valley had bought a couple of Greenville companies before that and gotten some good boats, the Yazoo City and some of those boats. And so these bigger companies and their investment groups were buying assets and making big companies out of a number of small companies, which then brings you around to the joke used to be that you could jump boat at Lock 26 and stand on the end of the wall with your duffel bag and get on the next boat to Lock South and have a job. And with those changes in the industry, we lost that kind of freedom to choose where we went. There are some good things that have come out of that, though, which are a combination of government regulation. You know, we talked last time about human resources and what the court has ruled that anything that's not specifically a Coast Guard regulation falls under the purview of OSHA. And just a number of little things that went on when the Mauvilla hit the railroad bridge over Bayou Canot in '93 and killed 42 people. All of a sudden, a light was shown on the towboat industry. Anything that was across the levee, people were not aware of at all. And the testimony, when Jerry Tinky went to testify before the Marine and Fisheries Subcommittee, they asked what the requirements were on an uninspected vessel. At that time, my first towboat license was an operator of uninspected towing vessels. Some of you may know that at that time there were first class pilot and master's license, which required a lot of time and required drawing and from memory and essay type questions. And so that primarily those licenses were towards steamboats. Valley Line and those kind of companies required a license, licensed engineers, licensed mates. But if you ran a diesel boat, you didn't need a license. And so there were a couple of incidents. A barge blew up in Lock 17, a gasoline barge. And then then they required a license. A license is an operator of uninspected towing vessels, which had pretty minimal requirements. You had to have 1,080 days, 8-hour days as a deckhand, had to pass a test, and you could get a full operator's license. If you were under 21 years old, you got a second class operator's license until you were 21. Those licenses were grandfathered in. That's why, and it was a makeup license to start easing the industry ahead in regulation. So we operated with those type of licenses until 1993, when it was found that the operator of the Mauvilla had failed his test 3 times, and really in his Coast Guard hearing had very little understanding of the way the equipment worked on the boat. Poor guy was dumped up there without the skills to do the job, got caught in the fog, did the best he could, and wound up killing a bunch of people. And that's a hell of a thing to live with. Well, that started the regulation that we have today. And along with, at that same time, the Exxon Valdez and that big thing shone a light. At that particular time, the only requirement for uninspected towing vessels was a whistle, a light, and a bell. You didn't have to have a radar, really didn't have to have radios. And we started moving forward with this. And then came subchapter M, which is an outgrowth of the American Waterways Operators Responsible Carrier Program. Billy Tausen, who was the chairman of the Fisheries Subcommittee, told the industry execs that were in Washington that they were going to have to police themselves, that this was unacceptable the way we were operating. We talked about in my last episode about some of the bad behavior on the upper Mississippi River. And those things were all coming to light. We had been running out of sight, out of mind. So Tausen gave the industry a chance to begin policing itself, bringing their own standards up without an onerous, heavy hand of government all of a sudden dumping on them. And in doing so, the American Waterways operators came up with the Responsible Carrier Program, which had a bunch of requirements to be a member. And if you were a towboat company and you were going to belong to the American Waterways operator, you would have to meet these RCP standards. So that started bringing the professionalism and regulation into the industry. Along with that, a new licensing structure came about. And that is where the Seamen's Church Institute came in. There were a couple of different companies, organizations that offered groundwater simulations to the industry, and they settled with the Seamen's Church Institute of New York, New Jersey, which had been around since 1844, was a ministry for sailors at that time, started doing simulations in World War I with blind simulators, and World War II to train merchant marine crews for the Liberty ships. And they became very proficient in maritime simulations. And so there's another change. And a lot of my coworkers were resentful because they were afraid they couldn't keep up. One of my leadership things, the guy talked about, people resist change for three reasons. They don't see the value, they're afraid they can't keep up, or they think it'd be too much work. And the new regulations that towboaters operate under are all three of those things for a lot of people. And so it was a very it was it was a huge shift in the industry away from out of sight, out of mind, got a flashlight and a chart, and I can go run a diesel boat because the boss said I can, and where we are today. That combined, so that's brought us where we are today, because some of the collateral damage for those kind of safety regulations is the bookkeeping, the record keeping that's required, and the increase in budgets to keep equipment up to the standards where they should be. And that has set us to a point where big companies basically are about the only ones that can afford to operate now. And so when you have Kirby, when Kirby picked up all kinds of canal companies, all kinds of liquids companies, all those companies in Greenville wound up under Kirby's umbrella. So you got Kirby and Ingram, ACBL, and a couple of other of the big companies that do spend money and do pay good wages, but boy, they're real selective, and they're going to treat you the way they want to treat you. If you don't like the way we do things, we'll send you down the road. And we get around then to what we had talked about last time, that you don't need a high school degree to crank ratchets or work a line. And you don't need a driver's license to work on a towboat. But the major companies feel that they can be that selective. I was having a conversation with some port captains about my mate had gone and gotten a personal loan in order to get his license and was paying that off. And they had promised him a steersman job. And finally, it came to the point where I said, you live in Owensboro, you got a license. I would recommend you just go to work for the Harbor Service there and start learning how to run a boat and then work your way up, kind of like I did. And I was telling that story to this group of port captains that Ingram had to come off their butts and start making pilots. And I was telling them that story, and they said, "Oh, that'd be the biggest mistake he'll ever make because Ingram is a big company and he'll never work for us again." Yada yada yada. And I thought, boy, you guys profess to be a family company, but you just gave me the corporate line right there. And my reply to them was, well, you know, Ingram is no better than any other company. At that time in the late 90s and into the 2000, 2005 when I left, everybody paid about the same, had about the same kind of benefits, and all of the equipment was about the same. So guys, you got to do something a little better to attract people. And they didn't, nobody likes to hear that. But that has brought us to a point where you continue to put guys in a crew van for a 10-hour ride from home down to the boat, and then they have to go on watch when they get to the boat. Guys that are getting off the boat after having stood their watch have to ride 10 hours back to Paducah. That's a crappy way to treat people. But if you don't like it, guess you go flip hamburgers at McDonald's.
Well, I was chatting with an active pilot out there on the water now a week or two ago that the caliber of individual in two generations now down the line that are
Mm-hmm.
starting today are being trained by a generation of pilots that were maybe rushed through a system where we're not properly prepared. They don't have the knowledge that those from the 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, they don't have the same quality and caliber maybe of training and
Mm-hmm.
preparation. Um, can you speak to that at all?
Yes, I sure can. Because uh, in 2005, just before I retired, I was making $1,000 a day as a trip pilot, and wages were bumping up to 1,200 a day, and that was because there was a shortage of pilots. The shortage of pilots was the fault of the industry in the way they treated people and uh, didn't promote people into steersman position and make their own pilots in house. And at that point, from about 2000, and I'm not real sure after I left, but what we were calling shotgunning pilots, because just as your other source was telling you, uh, companies were trying to drive the wages back down, and they were trying to flood the market with pilots in order to bring the wages down, which works until you get 42 or 45 feet on the Vicksburg gauge or 39 feet at Baton Rouge. And then I start getting, guys tell me, oh, we're not, uh, they tell me you're a heavy tow pilot. And I said, yeah, what are you paying? And he said 700 a day. And I said, nope, I'm not a heavy tow pilot. That's unit tow money there. But then when the high water came, I'd be getting all these calls for people and it's not the fault of the pilots that they had working for them at the time, because those guys had come through a program that was instituted by the company that did not properly prepare them. They were in such a hurry to get a pilot turned loose. That guy hadn't had the time to ride southbound in New Orleans and with 30 feet on the Memphis gauge, get on an airplane, go back to Paducah, get on another one and do that again and do that 6 or 7 times in a row. And that's another thing that I talked with, when I had some voice at Ingram, was you guys need to spend the money. You got these guys are making 2.5 or 3 miles an hour in high water coming northbound. Well, they need to learn that, but they need a lot of southbound trips in that kind of water. Go ahead and spend the money, get them an airplane ticket, run them back up here, put them on another boat, run them south again. And so that was all, once again, like I talked about in the last episode, that investment bankers and business majors, guy with an MBA, are now have got the ear of management in these companies, and they're doing things by dollar rather than by towboat.
There was a point you meant to make last time we spoke that we haven't exactly covered yet. So before I get into the questions that have developed since we pressed record this morning, fill me in um, to whatever degree with whatever stories from 50 years ago, as deeply as you want to cover this, but the difference in the way the hierarchical structure from the wheelhouse down has changed from 75 to 2025.
Okay. So the master of the vessel is still in charge from the tip of the mast, top of the mast to the tip of the rudders. But I was asked to go down into a tank barge one time at Southwest Shipyard in Houston with white rags to clean a barge by hand, uh, that it had diesel in it so that we could load unleaded gasoline. And at that, I refused. The captain said, "You're the mate on here, aren't you?" And I said, "Well, I guess I was. But if you're telling me I got to do that, then you're going to have to fire me." Now, at that time, I had no recourse. In this day and age, there are a lot of directions that a deckhand can go under those circumstances. And you can uh, call the port captain, you can call HR, call the crew dispatcher. The lines of communication are open, so that you don't have that kind of being treated that way. There were times coming out of the Illinois River one time that I was up about 40 hours, and I would go in and pull my coveralls down, lay on the bed for a few minutes, and get up and hack around in the ice some more. Well, that's just not the way to treat people. So there are laws and regulations that, hell, I've been to college for 3 years, but I wasn't aware a lot of it, but I knew some things were just wrong. You just don't do that stuff. And, my first trip on a boat, captain, I was about 11 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night, captain said, "Go out there and open all those drip pans." Oh, okay. I guess that's what we do. And we're going up the lower, dumping whatever was in those drip pans. Uh, First off, captains would not even presume to do that nowadays, ask you to do that kind of thing. And second, most deckhands know that we can't be doing that kind of stuff. So there'd be a refusal and a call to somebody if it if push came to shove over it. Uh, in a lot of ways, you have crew dispatchers or HR second guessing, intruding into the operation too much. For example, I've been very involved in safety projects at Ingram, and I had some guys come to work on the R. Clayton McWhirter that were fleet boat deckhands that wanted to make some extra money, and we were going to be dropping barges at Evansville, and we needed to carry about 3 sets of rigging back, and they refused. They said it wasn't safe to carry that rigging, and and I sat there and I explained to them, well, the barges back here on the face up are are liquids barges. They have wide gunnels. It's only 3 or 4 sets of rigging. At that time, I was like 50 years old. I said, I'll go out there and carry it all back by myself. Well, you ought to knock the boat out and we go out there and pick it up. I said, well, you're not on it. You're not on a fleet boat anymore. You know, that's not how this is going to work. You got two choices. You can get off at Evansville or you can carry it back. So then I get a call from HR and my port captain and explain to him my side of the story, which is aggravating. And it's aggravating to be questioned and have your authority questioned. But companies and the office will listen because of the abuses in the past. I was on a Spartan boat with a captain from Metropolis who we were at Lock 25 making a crew change. And when the crew van started unloading, he says, that first guy will make a deckhand. That second one won't get back past St. Louis. And that third son of a bitch ain't even getting on the boat. And he went out there and hollered, told that last guy, get back in the crew van. And he came back in. I said, have you worked with those guys? He said, no. I said, well, what the heck was that all about? And it was pretty much because he could do it. And so there are a lot of stories that you would hear uh, of that kind of thing and that caliber of people. Uh, People who I think we had started on some of this after a post that I'd made about a captain who had died of cancer of the heart. And I posted, I knew he was a black-hearted son of a bitch, but I didn't think he'd get cancer and die from it. But he was a horrible human being. And his brag at Spartan, he and another captain, was how many deckhands they'd run off in a year. And so the pendulum swung the other way for a while. And now it's kind of coming back a little bit, but that is some more of you bring an HR specialist in who's not a towboat person. He's got a degree in human resources and has worked for Procter and Gamble or someplace like that. And he comes into a towboat and doesn't understand the command structure or the culture and applies that model to a towboat. And so the master of the vessel has to be much more careful. Ingram used to send their problems to me because I would do the paperwork properly. You know, the guide said, you just can't fire anybody around here. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, I told the crew dispatcher not to send that son of a bitch back, and they sent him back anyway. I said, well, did you fill out the paperwork? Well, no, but I told him. Well, that's not how it works anymore, because when you fire a deckhand, he's gonna contest, he's gonna file for unemployment. The unemployment office is going to refer it to Ingram. Ingram is going to refuse it. Then there's going to be a hearing on whether this guy's going to get unemployment or not, and all the paperwork has to be in place. And in some instances, the paperwork is so screwed up that they have to reinstate a guy. And so that's just that's a matter of the times. And it has made things a lot better. You can't just arbitrarily fire some guy. I worked with a captain who was a canal pilot for years. His brag was he put some guys off on the Gumco Bridge one time. He said, you don't want to work here anymore? You want off? Okay, you can get off right there. And he leaned in on the bridge works. They threw their duffels up. And the guy said, you got to give us access to public transportation. He said, that's a highway. Hitchhike into town. And off down the canal they went. So you had those kind of abuses. Then on the other side, you have HR abuses, and somewhere along the way, hopefully, things are starting to reach some parity and make a little sense now.
Does that seem to be the case on the industry that you left? I believe it was what, about
Yeah,
three,
about
3 to 5 years
2000,
ago?
in 2005, actually. So it was 15 years ago. I've been out
Okay.
of this a while. I was looking at our last episode and watching myself and stuff. Gosh darn, you're an old man and you sound like an old man with some of that get off my lawn kind of stuff. But yeah, things have grudgingly gotten better. And you know, a lot of the old heads like me were complaining. One of my buddies, every time I'd pick up the radio to talk to him on the midnight watch, he'd say, we got to get this HR out of these companies. They're just ruining towboats. And I tell him, no, man, you're going to have to get used to it and quit cussing the deckhands. You just can't do that.
Yeah. In volatility of the market here in the continental states, with opportunities landside being as good or better than anything we can offer, it's put us in a certainly different position than the 70s. I've got a few more rather disparate questions, but let's stick with your tank barge experience for a few moments. I'm
Okay,
not sure if we discussed this last time or not,
we
but
didn't.
I've been in liquids dispatch for Ingram going on
Mhm.
2 years. It'll be 2 years in about 6 months. Um, a year and a half into it, fascinating world, totally different from everything I knew in dry. Um, Logistics, of course, similar, but the
Right.
requirements for these regulated vessels.
Yep.
Backtrack 50 years. Tell me some good stories that may come to mind dealing with the old single skin barges.
Oh Lord. So, uh, ivory soap and a rubber mallet, and you could fix an above the waterline leak where gasoline was leaking out of a single skin. And so you just leaned over there with a bar of hard soap and pounded it into the crack and went on down the river. Yeah, that's insane, isn't it? And we were coming out of Lockport, Illinois, with a single skin that was leaking like that. And one of the locks up there called because there was a sheen in the lock and it was gasoline. Now, fortunately, it was bitterly cold, but in warm weather, you're dragging and sparking down the lock wall with gasoline in there with you. That's insane. Uh, Red hand. Some of the old guys will know what that is. That was an early type of epoxy. So you would take red hand and pound that and mix it up and pound that into a crack. Uh, go down in a single skin. Well, go down in one of the void compartments. Yeah, go down in a double skin with mortar mix mixed up and a form. Knock a bunch of shingles into a crack in the bottom. Put the 2x4 form around it, and put concrete in there to patch a barge yourself, which is patently illegal. God, I didn't know any of that stuff. Uh, we ran acrylonitrile and vinyl acetate to Monsanto, from Monsanto, Texas City to Monsanto, Decatur, Alabama. That stuff is highly carcinogen and causes chemical burns. It does all kinds of nasty stuff. And we had no personal protective equipment. I traded for a mask. So that in Texas City, they were United Chemical Workers Union. They came out in forced air suits, do all their gauging and hookup and disconnection. I traded a bunch of coffee for a mask down there so that when I'm discharging these barges, I'm not breathing these fumes. So, uh, yeah, I mean, I don't know if, because I depended on the captain to keep me safe. And it's reasonable. It's reasonable for a deckhand to expect the captain or the mate to watch out for him and keep him safe. And so I was doing these things like I talked about dumping the drip pans. Shoot, that was acrylonitrile that we were dumping in there into a water system that municipal water intakes are using downstream of where I was dumping that stuff. And so it was ridiculous. Uh,
Well,
now,
what was the policy or procedure? You mentioned above the waterline fractures on a single skin. What if there's a
mhm.
sheen and it's coming from underwater? What was the procedure then? Uh, Impossible to recover.
Yeah. Well, and at that time, they really weren't that concerned with it. That was not, let's see, the Cuyahoga River had caught fire a couple of times in 1972. The Illinois Sanitary Canal above Lockport would catch fire. And so that was just all kind of the cost of doing business. You went ahead and ran like that. Uh,
It's a hell of a cost.
It is. It is a hell of a cost. I think on that deal on the Illinois River that I was referencing, the Coast Guard, let's see, what would he have been? There was some kind of uh, high enlisted Coast Guard came out and looked at us. Okay, well, that's not that bad. We'll write you up a proceed and then don't load again on a single skid. And we were going from there down into heavy ice. So, it only got worse. Uh, a lot of that made it pretty good for my late career. You talked about markets. I would run a trip for grain companies during the grain push. And then when it slowed down a bunch, I could catch trips with petroleum companies and run here and there. And it still goes on. My dad was an airline pilot. He had told me that the regulations will work against you or they'll work for you, but you need to know them. I was on a boat tripping for a company, and they had Vicksburg came out to do a tank barge inspection, and one of the glasses in the inspection port was leaking. So we got the form, which I can't recall the number of right now, that said you can't load it until the guy who signed it, has signed off on it. So we go to New Orleans. The company
Was
comes
that an
out.
835?
Yep, 835. So we get an 835. We go to New Orleans. They replace the glass and the seals and stuff. We start back up the river. I'm on watch. I got a very young captain on the boat, and I'm the pilot. And I get orders to load this barge at Plains St. James. And so I call the weekend duty guy and I said, we can't load this barge because it's got an 835 out there, and the law says that the inspector is the one that has to sign to rescind the 835. And he said, well, just take it out of the mailbox. And I said, just take it out of you're telling me just take this form out of the mailbox. He said, yeah, just take it out of the mailbox. It's been fixed. It's no big deal. I said, no, actually, it is a big deal. It's a federal regulation, and it is a big deal. He said, no, it'll be okay. Nobody will know. I said, nobody will know unless a ship loses steering coming down that long straightaway and runs into the dock, and they come out there checking everything, and then we're going to go to jail. And he said, well, it's okay because I'm telling you to do it. I said, well, then send me an email that that's what you want me to do, which was my dad's advice on everything, is get it in writing. And so that was a big blow up, and got a call from their weekend dispatcher, and Kevin Flowers, and he was laughing. He said, man, what'd you say to that guy? He was so mad. I said, I just need an email. I'm going to staple 835 and the email together, and I'm putting them in the red book. And it's on you guys. You have privity or knowledge at that point. So that stuff still goes on. Uh, One of the things that went on in the old days that will still go on is a boat that's overloaded, it's going south. It's gotten better, but I was on boats at Ingram, on boats all through my career that might get down to a 3/10 of a mile an hour or a half a mile an hour in high water, and that's as good as they were going to go. They weren't going to stop. And everybody should remember that Rule 6, the safe speed rule, requires you to be able to stop or maneuver to avoid a collision in a distance appropriate to the prevailing circumstances. And so, uh, when I called the port captain and told him, we're gonna have to drop a string. This isn't gonna work. Oh, it'll be okay because they'll have a tug at Great Rivers to catch you when you get there. So, no, that's not how the law works. The law don't say back in under a dike or drag down the bank or have a tug catch you. The law says the boat has to be able to stop. So now what are we going to do? You have privity or knowledge of this. And that goes back to what we talked about in the RC Crapel accident, that if the company has privity or knowledge of a condition which affects the seaworthiness of the vessel, then liability is unlimited in the case of an accident. So if I had taken that tow and I had told them, and I got down, they were building the new Cape Bridge at the time, and I couldn't get stopped, and they wanted me to stop, and I ran over a construction flat down there and killed some guys, then the liability would have been unlimited for Ingram Barge Company. So as you are as young guys starting their career, guys that are in the kind of in the middle years of their career, as you get to the point where you're having these kind of discussions with dispatchers and then your port captain, remember the CFRs which apply to towboats like CFR 33164-80, which is the equipment has to be working in the pilot house, uh, about the ones that talk about how many generators you have to have on a boat. If you lose a generator, you no longer have an extra generator. That is a 10, that's a 2692 reporting requirement, and you're going to have to stop. Uh, if you lose a radar, you know, if you have another radar, it's okay to keep going. But if you don't have another radar, you can't keep going. It's against the law. So you need to know those laws so that when you run up against a harried dispatcher, as you know, you're trying to get things to a certain place, and there's a Union Carbide or one of them has uh, uh, needs that needs that caustic soda on the Ohio River, and they're going to run out in 10 days and have to shut down the plant. So there's pressure on you. But there's also pressure with me that you are now asking me to do something from my end that's against the law. So we're going to have to find a better way to get this done, whether it's put that barge in another tow or get someone out here to fix this thing as we go past Greenville or one of those places. But we just can't ignore these problems and hope they go away or that nobody notices. And when you find yourself saying it'll be okay just this once, it's time to stop what you're doing.
Do you have any insights as to the growth and development of the tank barge segment of this market over the years?
Yeah, I really do. And this is something that I argued with my more conservative and drill baby drill friends about pipelines. Pipelines are unattended, and so there can be a leak out on a pipeline, and it won't be noticed until the plug comes through, and you realize that the total loading that was the subscriber sent down this pipeline didn't make it, unless it's in a neighborhood like it was in Chillicothe, Illinois, in about 1999, where they blew refined crude all over a residential neighborhood. Tank barges are constantly manned and constantly cared for, constantly inspected. And so I was making a lot of money as a trip pilot running Canadian tar sands crude from Wood River to Garyville, Louisiana. And so the big fight was we want this pipeline to run to Cushing, Oklahoma, and bypass the towboats and the loading and the unloading on both ends. Well, you know, the corporate machine had everybody believing that it was the tree huggers and the bunny huggers that were being ridiculous about this, but it meant a lot of jobs. There was a big building boom going on in those 2400 to 18 to 24 to 3200 horsepower boats. There was a lot of tank barges being built. There were rail cars being built and run around the country. And all those were American jobs. We're going to get to this in a minute too, or maybe in the next episode. I'm going to bring up the Jones Act, the Captain's Laws in 1926. And they say that vessels operating on coastwide voyages or in the inland waters have to be built in U.S. shipyards and crewed by U.S. crews. Now that's job protection, and that's very important. So all of the barges that were being built to transport Canadian tar sands crude down the Mississippi River were being built by Americans and crewed by Americans. And we were constantly, as you know, every 6 hours out there checking and looking at stuff. So, uh, of course, there are accidents. You hit bridges and spill oil, but those are an anomaly. There are hundreds of thousands of cargo miles moved every year in the U.S. that no one hears about until somebody smacks the Vicksburg Bridge. And then everybody looks at it and says, oh my God, that's terrible. Well, yeah, I do have an opinion on that, it's good. Running liquids in barges are good for the United States. They're good for the economy, and they're good for American workers of a number of different types.
Well, I will take that with a smile, as it has become my day job, my career.
Hmm.
Uh, I guess the chase continues, learning something new every day, every year, every
Right.
dispatch area, every kind of anyway.
Yeah, we
Um,
were loading Dakota uh, shale oil at Caruthersville, brought it in on rail cars there and loaded it there and took it to Louisiana to be refined. And most of that stuff goes to be in diesel fuel because it's not suitable for anything else. They can make some of it into gasoline. Most of it is refined into diesel and is shipped to China uh, because it's not suitable for lubricating oils or any of that kind of stuff. It's a bitumen and not a true oil. So anyway, that's we can move on to the next
well,
topic.
yeah, no, we'll stay kind of in the same vein, but a different
Hmm.
business line. You mentioned when this first began that the grain and coal export markets fell apart
Hmm.
at the time of the embargo. Over the years since, so that's what, 45 years?
Yep. Yep.
Have you seen a rebound in the grain and coal markets, and how has that maybe been affected, not so much the grain, but the coal, especially coal and pet coke and those industries, how they've been affected by the, say, the efforts of the EPA and
Right.
or environmental concerns?
Okay. So first off, let's start out uh, with the tariffs and the trade war that's going on. I would not advise anyone to be making large purchases. Don't be buying a new bass boat or a new pickup truck right now because soybean markets are the Chinese are buying soybeans from someplace else. And if you're on a grain boat, you're dependent on export grain and foreign countries buying it. Uh, the coal that was hurt by EPA regulations primarily comes out of the Ohio River Valley. And that's been the big fight with coal miners. It was high sulfur, not as clean a coal as comes across out of Wyoming. So Ingram, a lot of other companies load coal in St. Louis at a couple of terminals there, or at Coracoal or Ford Transfer, and they bring it on around to run primarily up to the Tennessee Valley Authority plants, up to Tennessee River. So that market has really gone downhill and fallen apart. There was a lot of guys arguing and fussing and mad at Obama and mad at this and mad at that. I told them, guys, you need to start posting up on other rivers besides the Ohio and the Tennessee, because those jobs are going away. That's a fact of life. It's just like when steamboats went from burning wood that was piled along the riverbanks by woodcutters, and the steamboat would pull in and charge up on fuel and leave their money in a jar, to then running coal, to running oil, to running diesel, and now running Tier 4 diesel. But the point is that every industry improves the way it does business, becomes more efficient. Coal is more efficient in the amount of BTUs it puts out than wood in firing a boiler. Oil is more efficient, or natural gas, than coal is. And so there are other side things that free market capitalism has recognized that are now influencing the coal industry as well. So we would run coal into Genoa, Wisconsin, to a Dairyland power plant there. We would drop those coal barges. It was Western coal, Wyoming coal coming up out of St. Louis. And that coal had to have a tug to transfer the barges to the dock. They had to have an unloader operating the unloader. Then they had to have a half a dozen guys, laborers and operators piling the coal up. Then they burn the coal and all the maintenance that goes on with burning coal, because coal leaves a lot of deposits in flues and on injectors. And the fly ash that comes out is a hazardous waste. So a coal-fired plant has to have a pit in the ground with a clay base and then a rubber liner to put all that coal ash in. And it's full of mercury and nickel and cadmium and all kinds of heavy metals that are bad for you. And so that was very labor intensive. You can pipe a natural gas pipeline into a, a fired fossil fuel fired plant, and you eliminate all of the jobs that it took to get the coal there, unload it, take care of it, and put it away. And you got a guy in a control room now pushing buttons to open and close valves to get the natural gas to the proper boiler. So it's not just ETA, it's market driven forces that once EPA and the government made it onerous enough to burn coal, capitalists, free market capitalism, recognized that the opportunity was there to use natural gas. Natural gas burns cleaner and is much less labor intensive to get to the plant. So you can't just blame the government and the tree huggers for that one.
Well, as we were talking, I realized that there was a question I forgot. So backtracking a little bit to the tank barge situation.
Okay,
You mentioned your contention with a captain that asked you to go down inside a tank, an empty tank, and scrub the walls
right.
manually. I heard early on, I think episode 6, a gentleman that came up around the same time as you. His path took him a different route. Um, but he said, I believe it was him, that to clean oil barges, black oil barges,
Hmm.
you would open the hatch, have a mop tied to a rope,
Yep.
swinging it around, wringing it out, doing it again.
Hmm.
And that's how these barges are cleaned. Now, I know in my experience today, dispatching liquids, cleaning facilities, the personnel that are getting on there and how they're doing this is a far cry from a mop on a rope.
Oh yeah.
So tell me about your experiences in that vein, back in aside from the one say, hey, crawling. It was a gasoline empty he asked you to get into?
No, it was a diesel empty,
Okay.
and they were going to load unleaded gasoline. So it depended on the product that was coming back behind the recent unloading. So if you had gasoline, they would load, before unleaded, they would load regular gas or high test gasoline right. You really didn't have to clean the barge. What we had were pneumatic pumps and a stripping pole, and you hooked a hose to it. And if the tankerman was good, the way the barge rose up and unloaded, what little bit of product was left there was in the sump around the intake for the pump, and you could stick that suction hose in there and strip that out, and that went into slop tanks, which were uh, on the on the barge, and then that slop was then uh, was then pumped off with people that did that kind of work. And yes, we used a mop on a spike pole to get the last of the gasoline out of that sump. Now, when you went back with a different product, so if you had diesel or uh, we really didn't run much heavy oil, uh, but if you had diesel or that kind of product, you could not load unleaded gasoline back on top of it. And if the previous discharge had been leaded gasoline, it had to be clean and pretty dry in there. And so we did that, and then you just left the hatches open. And used to have the little canvas things that you put over the domes that would catch the air and push air down into the tank to air it out as you went along. And so that was pretty ridiculous. I worked a court case, the Mobile explosion where the tank barge blew up in a cleaning facility in Mobile Harbor. And those guys were
Was
doing,
that in the mid 2010s with AEP?
yes, Yep,
Okay.
yep, yep. And what they had done there is that barge had loaded casing head gasoline, which is a gasoline through geological forces comes out refined. The heat of the earth has made this into a gasoline that needs very little refining to burn in your car, but it's very volatile. And so they had a barge that needed to be cleaned, to be repaired, and they took it to a cleaning facility. And it was, you know how New Orleans is in the summertime. You'll have a 90-degree night and 85 or 88% humidity, and it's just still. And they were ventilating this barge. They should have stripped the barge, washed the barge, ventilated the barge. But in order to save money on pumping off slop, they started ventilating the barge and discharging volatile organic compounds into the air that we all breathe, gasoline fumes. And it was hot enough and humid enough, the atmospheric conditions were right, that the gasoline fumes were coming out of the domes and out of the hatches and then pouring across the barges down to the slip that they were in. And when the AEP boat came in to drop off their radio technician, they drew those gasoline fumes into the diesels. The diesels ran away and started an explosion, which I think killed 2 guys and badly burned 6 others. But that was a deliberate uh, contravention of regulations and safety practices. Okay, and so that's old. When people talk to you about the old days, oh man, must have been great in the old days. Well, that's the kind of crap that was an anomaly in the 2010s. But that's the kind of crap that went on all the time before regulation and before the professionalism of companies was raised.
Yeah, I worked at AEP when I first started out in the industry with
Mm-hmm.
an individual that was on that boat that night. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I've not been able to get him lined up on the show. His life took him on its own path since I've seen him, which has been a while now. But somehow I'm not surprised that you were involved in such cases, and you've been around a while, sir. You've seen it all, you've done it all. I I am fresh out of question, and it seems that trying to communicate this way instead of t stay attentive for 6 hours in one day is quite the marathon. My mind is kind of melted right now, and I do have again 6 hours of at least 6 to 8 hours of editing
Right.
uh, to get all this stuff done. But before we wrap here, is there anything else we haven't covered, or anything else you wanted to close on?
No, no. If we'll think a little bit, I'm available for more of this. One of the things that I think is important that we just touched on, in that AEP case, the captain was sued personally in state court because AEP was being sued in federal court, and they had applied for a limitation of liability. And of course, 2 wrongful deaths and 6 guys being horribly burned was going to go way above what the AEP boat was worth. And so the attorneys in that case brought it to state court because pilots and captains are carried as additionally insured and they could get a lot more money out of it. So I'd like to talk about that a little bit as kind of an education for people who are interested, who are current mariners, about the liabilities you face, about the responsibilities you have, not only to your crew and the company, but to yourself as well.
Well, I do have another, half hour or so before I need to get started on some other things. So if you do want to speak to that, by all means, feel free.
Well, I think we could do that in another episode. Let's
Okay.
let's let's line that up as an episode, a standalone, because I've been involved in a lot of court cases over 24 years and read every one of the judge's decisions, which made me a much better pilot and much better able to coach young pilots on what you can do with dispatchers or port captains and how to go and strategies to use to keep yourself and the company out of trouble. And I think that would probably be a standalone episode.
Sounds like a plan, sir. We'll get
Okay,
it
very
done.
good. All right. Well, I appreciate your company again.
Yes, sir.
And you try and get a little rest.
Hmm. There ain't no rest for the wicked, sir. We
Well, you're young.
got to keep this machine going. But
You're young.
I'll stay that way as long as I can. But indeed,
I
sir, I do
agree.
appreciate it. We'll keep in touch. We'll get together again soon.
Okay, very good. Well, take care, everybody.
Thanks very much.